talk about, but not describe in detail, I hope, the Confederate soldier and infantry combat and how we don't understand what he suffered necessarily. Many of us don't. If you want to know how bad infantry combat can be, I won't go into it here, but Google the Battle of Spotsylvania Courthouse and go down the history till you see the bloody angle on 12 May 1864, especially the mule shoe part where the bodies on top of that ridge, small berm, were 4 to 5 deep during the 12-hour battle, and it lasted most of the next night. The soldiers were under there dying, and so many soldiers at such close combat were killing each other. They even shot a tree down 22 inches in diameter, and just rifle fire shot the tree down during the evening. Just stray bullets cut the tree completely down. But you may do that if you like. The tradition of the citizen soldier. We think we know the Confederate soldier, how brave and enduring he was, how tough, how committed. Many civilians have an incomplete idea about the true nature of soldiering, the fatigue, the privations, the joys of camaraderie, and the paralyzing effect of fear. Especially, they might have little understanding of the unspeakable nature of infantry combat. Throughout our national history, the citizen soldier, by a wide margin, not the professional soldier, fought our wars. Men who were basically civilians a short time before discovered the true nature of the soldier, doing what warriors ultimately do, killing other human beings. I want to look at the nature of such a soldier, his history, his training, what his training and especially what eventual infantry combat can do to his mind, his spirit. I do not mean post-traumatic stress disorder, as real and lamentable as that is, but about what immersion into the spirit of the infantry does to him positively, strange as that is to say. If he is to be an infantry soldier, he must learn to be a fighter, both in technique and in spirit, something that alters him and does not usually leave him when his army experience is over. We will see 3 examples later on of South Carolina Confederate infantrymen who, after the war, overcame their combat experiences to lead productive, commendable lives. Robert Wallace Shand, the Reverend William Pochet DuBose, and Dr. Harry Hastings Wyman. The Confederate Army. In February and March of 1861, the Provisional Confederate Congress established first a provisional volunteer army that would exist only in time of war, and then it established a small permanent regular army. These 2 armies would exist concurrently, but only the Provisional Army of the Confederate States was a real fighting army, consisting of almost all the regular, volunteer, and conscripted men who were in the war. The regular army of the Confederate States of America, as opposed to the Provisional Army, contained relatively few soldiers and a few high-ranking generals to ensure that they outranked all militia officers of the Provisional Army. The regular army at length consisted only on paper. The result is that almost all Confederate soldiers were citizen soldiers, as opposed to regular soldiers of a standing army. Some ardent defenders of Confederate flags who support the 19th century Southern cause and extol the courage, endurance, and faith of the Confederate soldier might be satisfied with cinematic portrayals of Confederate and Union combat that is about as realistic as children's treasured video games depicting violence. Am I coming across back there, Luke? Can you hear? Thank you. 2 English poets might suggest the difference between the appearance and reality of the combat soldier's life. The Happy Warrior. William Wordsworth, early in the 19th century, has a poem entitled The Character of the Happy Warrior, in which he trotted out platitudes, one after another, about glory, patriotism, courage, and higher virtues connected with the discipline of the soldier. he concluded with words pointing to the object of his admiration. This is the happy warrior. This is he that every man in arms should wish to be. Herbert Reed, R-E-A-D, served with the Yorkshire Regiment in the trenches of the First World War. Among his vivid and realistic poems is one he wrote as a disgusted, brutal parody of Wordsworth's unknowing praise of the combat fighter. Reed takes Wordsworth's title and goes his own knowing way. The Happy Warrior. His wild heart beats with painful sobs. His strained hands clench an ice-cold rifle. His aching jaw grips a hot, parched tongue. His wide eyes search unconsciously. He cannot shriek. Bloody saliva dribbles down his shapeless jacket. I saw him stab and stab again a well-killed Boche, a German soldier. This is the happy warrior. This is he. On the home front, people speak in platitudes, thoroughly moving and sincerely offered. In several decades, perhaps many decades after combat experience, some veterans join in praise of the warrior. That is at home. In the field, future vets stab and stab again the well-killed enemy. Or they stab our sons, brothers, fathers, and husbands. The culprits, beauty and art. Is there any remedy to war? No. No remedy exists. None will ever exist. None but total annihilation. An end to human beings means an end to war. Roaches and sharks do not war on each other, as far as I know. Ants sometimes fight ant wars, but who cares? The reason we admire Wordsworth's happy warrior, or Reed's unhappy warrior, is that a thing of beauty is a joy forever. The object of Wordsworth's praise in places has a kind of heroic beauty. It's a long poem, one can argue. Reed's poem is concrete, sensuous, vivid, evocative, pitiful, violent, sacrificial in its way, accurate, true, memorable, and alas, beautiful. It is beautiful on a much smaller scale in the way the stories of King Lear and King Oedipus are beautiful, affecting our feelings in a rarefied way, a sublime purging of our emotions, shocking us with pity and fear that we human beings are capable of finding ourselves in such circumstances as Oedipus, Lear, and Reed's warrior. The citizen soldier. The subject is the citizen soldier, and the following discussion of administrative differences between the citizen soldier and his counterpart, the professional soldier, or soldier in a standing army, our attention might be drawn away from the wildly beating heart, painful sobs, parched tongue, bloody saliva, and repeated stabbing of a dead enemy soldier. The Southern culture we bring to life here on Seabrook Island, the way of life we study, the politics, religion, literature, music, social relationships, and the rest, all resulted in women and men and children of sufficient age all experiencing wildly beating hearts, painful sobs, parched tongues, and more in every quarter of the South during 4 years of war. As civilians, they lived every moment of the closing down of a civilization. It was a tragic ending because the northern enemy thought they saw in this southern civilization a tragic flaw, and at length they destroyed that civilization in their own northern spirit of presumed moral ascendancy. The Confederacy separated from the Union playing the better part, but fate and dishonor in Washington caused the South at the outset of the war to play into the hands of a clever Union lawyer become president. Tragic irony indeed. The citizen soldier and the professional soldier of the Confederacy had given all they had, those who stayed the fight. Much of modern politics and society, being what they are, allow that only the courage, endurance, and competence of the Confederate soldier are acceptable as a focus of the best of the former Southern civilization centered in the 4 years of the Confederacy. I wrote this a few days ago. Memorials of the Confederacy today are usually suffered if they are said to honor the courage of the Confederate soldier, not the Old South civilization. Who is the citizen soldier? The citizen soldier is an everyday person who willingly puts his life on hold to defend, aid, and protect his community and his country. Citizen soldiers were the militiamen of the American Revolution, the volunteer regiments of the War of 1861 to 1865, and the National Guard and Reserve units of today. Traditionally, the citizen soldier makes up the ranks of the militias, reserves, and National Guard troops. Their counterpart is the soldier of a standing army, which is permanent, often a professional army. It is composed of full-time soldiers, usually volunteers, and it is not disbanded during times of peace. It differs from Army reserves, who are enrolled for the long term but activated only during wars or natural disasters, or temporary armies, which are raised from the civilian population only during a war or threat of war and disbanded once the war or threat is over, as in the Confederate War and the 2 World Wars. Standing armies tend to be better equipped, better trained, and better prepared for emergencies, for defensive deterrence, and particularly better prepared for wars. Why do men fight wars? War fascinates. Combat fascinates. A cliche is that few men who volunteer as soldiers want desk jobs. Many want to see the elephant. They want to be in the action. All countries seem to find young men to fight their wars, sometimes welcoming allies who are rarely wanting. Prostitution might have a challenge as the oldest profession. To see the elephant, especially in the 1861 to 1865 war, was a metaphor for having experienced combat. The metaphor is often associated with traveling circuses. In the early 19th century, villagers would return home after going to see a circus at a nearby town, and the first question asked them by their neighbors at home was, "Did you see the elephant?" which was a most exotic animal at the time. So it was with Union soldiers especially, who returned home on leave during the war. Their friends and acquaintances used the elephant metaphor, wanting to know what they saw, what they experienced, combat being about the most exciting and horrifying experience a person can encounter. Just imagine. No, we cannot imagine. I cannot imagine any more than we can imagine romantic or conjugal love if we have not experienced it. Think about that. I am most happily married, by the way, in case you misinterpreted that sentence. War is fascinating. Really happily married. War is fascinating not only to frontline infantrymen. More than one general has had his say about war. One with as much pith as Patton ever uttered on the subject. On December 13th, 1862, senior Confederate commanders above the town of Fredericksburg sat their horses atop a ridge looking down and around at their own regiments and batteries spread in confident defense and waiting. Brigades and more brigades of Union troops were crossing the Rappahannock River at the foot of the long ridge with tens of thousands of glistening bayonets above the marching troops, while the morning sun cleared the mist on this cold day. It's all in the record. It's a cold day. It's beautiful. In all of history, I would rather have been on that ridge than anywhere else, just to see that and what followed. Seeing this spectacle, Robert E. Lee is said to have commented to James Longstreet, It is well that war is so terrible, else we should grow too fond of it. An answer to the question of why men fight wars on a personal level is simply that they like war better than they like the quiet life they are leading or have led. We can say those who have not seen combat do not know what they are volunteering for. That is not always the case. Among the many Confederate and Union generals who fought with distinction as younger officers in the Mexican War 15 years earlier were Robert E. Lee, Stonewall Jackson, James Longstreet, Pierre Gustave Toutant Beauregard, and Joseph E. Johnston. They and their Mexican War comrades who were later in the Union Army fought against each other in that subsequent war that for most of them completed their military careers. The number of boys and young men and older men, if truth be told, who are attracted to the idea of war, to the idea of volunteering to be warriors, might surprise many. Something in the male human being at times is driven to the unthinking challenge of combat. Perhaps God gave men, some men, death and war, so that they might not grow despairing over the vacuity of unrelieved peace and contentment. Some historical antecedents of standing armies and citizen soldiers. Lucius Quinctius Cincinnatus laid down his plow in 458 BC when authorities in Rome nominated him to be dictator in order to take over the Roman army to defeat an enemy. He did so, then resigned as dictator 2 weeks later after defeating the enemy and returned home to his plow. James Kibler, this is about you. The Society of the Cincinnati in this country's oldest patriotic organization, founded in 1783 by officers of the Continental Army and their French counterparts who served together in the American Revolution. What a concept. Join up, serve to protect and defend one's country, then resign and go back to civilian pursuits. Ancient Greek warriors were more a model of citizen soldiers than were ancient Roman soldiers. Greek hoplites, citizen soldiers of ancient Greek city-states, were heavy infantry warriors. They were farmers and artisans with property, free citizens able to afford bronze armor and weapons. Their basic formation was the phalanx, closely grouped to protect themselves and the man on each side. They received basic military training. Soldiers in the Roman legions were different from Greek soldiers. Legionnaires had to be Roman citizens, at least 20 years old, and had to remain unmarried during their time of military service, which was an enlistment of at least 25 years. They retired with a pension or were given land for farming. They were citizen soldiers in that they had to be Roman citizens, but they were a standing army, not citizen soldiers we are considering for the most part. Roman soldiers also ate only 2 meals a day. They get up in the morning, they do their work details, about 11 o'clock one big meal, about 5 o'clock another one, and then they went back to bed. Probably fell in bed. In Julius Caesar's time, the soldiers of the Gauls under Vercingetorix were peasants from various Gallic tribes around modern-day France who fought to defend their homes against the Romans. In early medieval times, peasants, farm laborers, and others of the lower classes were required to fight because medieval monarchs required their barons to supply the king's army with soldiers from their domains. Later in the Middle Ages, middle-class freemen were often soldiers. They could afford their own iron helmets and battle axes or swords. Later monarchs often used foreign mercenaries. By the 13th century, the army under Edward I of England consisted of paid soldiers. Earlier medieval soldiers fought because their food, their future employment, depended on doing as they were told. Among the revolutionary soldiers, Francis Marion showed himself to be a singularly able leader of irregular militiamen who were citizen soldiers. You know about him and Bannister, that's how you pronounce that, Bannister Tarleton in the southern swamps. They never caught the fox. He tried. The Army Special Forces and Army Rangers traced their guerrilla tactics to those used by Marion largely in the swamps of South Carolina. For 10 years, twice a year, I was telling someone in late October when the snakes had gone home to roost and there weren't mosquitoes, and in late March, I took groups of cadets, sometimes up to 24, with a few Marine sergeants who were studying at the Citadel, through these swamps where Francis Marion was. And we'd enter, after the parade, we'd enter at twilight and walk an hour and a half at night, no flashlight, swim a creek, I'd swim a rope across, get on the other side. We'd spend all weekend in the swamps. And we'd see water moccasin from time to time. I told the cadets, if they were freshmen particularly, to wear a hard hat because the swamp had needle-nosed spiders. And they stay in the vines above you, and they drop down on the head of a human being, and they can suck the brains out of a freshman in 15 seconds. They can. This is serious stuff. I'd write them an email about this before they went. And I said they can suck out a sophomore's brains in 45 seconds, a junior in a minute and a half, and a senior in 2.5 minutes. So juniors and seniors can swat them off before that time. And I think some freshmen believe that. That was, I'd always wanted to see if I could do again as an old man what I did as in Army Ranger training in the swamp phase, because we'd walk all night through swamps, chest deep, with nothing but no flashlight, tritium dial compass, and a map wouldn't help. You just had to stay on your azimuth. And where we walked, once one of my former students who was airborne and Ranger qualified, he was about 35 at the time, he got there early, and I gave him the azimuth, and he went through it for 1.5 miles in the daytime, and then came around and met us, and we went through it at night, and I said, well, you take charge. You can read a map and read a compass. And we walked for an hour, swam a creek, going hand over hand on that rope, got on the other side and walked we'd gone another 20 minutes, and I was third man back. I was checking my compass, make sure, but he was good. He stayed right on azimuth. Now this is in the dead of night in a cypress swamp, and we were always waist to thigh deep in water. And finally we were getting near where we were going to get up on high ground, and about ankle deep, and the guy behind me, Darrell Stafford, said, hey, Colonel, stop. Doug, look back here. He said, I just stepped through this forked tree on top of a stump and stepped down. This is exactly where you came on azimuth this afternoon. He said, well, darn if it isn't. And the guys who came with him that afternoon, because they came down from North Carolina before I brought the cadets, he had followed that azimuth so directly at night in the middle of a swamp, tripping over stumps underwater, dodging vines, that he had gone exactly through the fork of a tree the next night. Now that's good. Army Rangers are hard to beat, I tell you, don't put them up against other people. But they're a little crazy, as you will see. The Confederate soldier. That's going to stick us over 2 minutes, I'm sorry. The Confederate infantrymen from South Carolina, among many, have left writing describing their experiences. Beginning in the 1890s, a Columbia lawyer, Robert Wallace Shann, through his Columbia Land and Development Company, began developing 305 acres now known as the Old Shandon District of Columbia, which still bears his name. Robert Shann was born in 1840 and died in 1915, read law under future General Maxcy Gregg in Columbia, and joined the famous and highly regarded South Carolina Volunteer Regiment, Kershaw's Regiment, in 1861. These were Lee's and Longstreet's shock troops. They often had them right at the front. Shann fought in the battles of Second Manassas, Savage Station, Maryland Heights, Sharpsburg, and Fredericksburg. His great-grandson, Julian Shann, a retired physics professor living in Columbia, is my childhood friend and distant relative. A decade ago, he lent me a copy of his great-grandfather's Memories of the War, a typed manuscript entitled Incidents in the Life of a Private Soldier in the War Waged by the United States Against the Confederate States, 1861 to 1865, Robert Wallace Shann, Company C, 2nd South Carolina Volunteers. The Ohio State University Department history department has a copy about which one of their websites says, "See especially the fabulous memoir by Robert Shan for the first half of the war." The manuscript is in the South Caroliniana Library at USC in Columbia. This is one of the best things I've ever read directly from a private soldier in the war. And this man was a gentleman. In the memoir, Private later Sergeant Shan recalled standing in a Confederate line of battle inside a tree line on the edge of the field, firing at a Union battle line out in the field. You know how they fired at each other. He described the enemy many balls zipping through the trees above and around him, sending shattered twigs and dislodged leaves raining down on him. He explained that soldiers usually reloaded as fast as possible and fired quickly at the blue-clad lines of men before them, leveling their rifle muskets at the mass of the enemy. In the middle of this firing, he decided to aim at a particular enemy soldier, he said, to determine whether or not his bullets were finding targets. He counted 3 soldiers to the right of the Union flag, aimed at that soldier, fired, and paused to look at the effect. The targeted soldier dropped his rifle, threw his arms up, and fell over backwards. Private Shan reloaded, and continued doing his duty. Robert Shan of Columbia was a gentleman from one of the most cultured South Carolina families of his time. His mother was descended from 5 colonial governors, 4 from South Carolina, and 1 the last royal governor of Georgia. In 1863, he married Louisa, the daughter of Dr. Philip Gadsden of Charleston. I remind those from off that South Carolina is not a state in the Union, but a vast cousinage. We know what Robert Shan, a student of law, a gentleman, thought about killing an enemy soldier. We saw how much that bothered him, which is not at all, apparently. It bothered some of you. I could see your faces when I read that. For the reaction to combat experienced by another intelligent and cultured Midland South Carolinian, we can turn to Faith, Valor, and Devotion, the Civil War letters of William Portraying de Beau's 2010, edited by Eric Emerson and Karen Stokes, who is usually at these summer schools, or often at these summer schools. De Beau's, of Huguenot descent, of course, was a well-educated gentleman born on a large plantation near Winsboro, South Carolina. He was the highest-ranking cadet and the first honor graduate of the Citadel class of 1855. He served as assistant professor of English his senior year. He took a master's degree from the University of Virginia in 1859 and joined South Carolina's Holcomb Legion of the Confederate Army as an adjutant early in the war. He was wounded twice at 2nd Manassas and once at the Battle of Kinston, North Carolina. He later became a chaplain in Kershaw's brigade and ministered to Kershaw's men in combat during the heavy fighting at Spotsylvania, Cold Harbor, and Petersburg. After the war, he served as chaplain of the School of Moral Science and the Christian Religion at the University of the South at Sewanee. He helped establish the theological department there and was a professor in the department for 16 years and then dean of the department for 14 years. He is widely acknowledged as the foremost theologian in the history of the Episcopal Church in this country. A brief, readable biography, it's good, it's simple, but it's good. Biography of de Beau's by John M. Wilson is entitled, I Have Looked Death in the Face, 1997. Robert Wallace Shan and William Portraying de Beau's were not violent men by nature, nor gentlemen turned brutish by focused infantry training or serious exposure to infantry combat. They did their duty as a matter of course. These soldiers and their kind were true citizen soldiers who had other plans for their lives before they volunteered for a cause during the duration of a war. I remember my father and aunts referring to William Portraying de Beau as Uncle Willie because he was their great uncle. The code of war. Shan and de Beau, as gentlemen of the Old South, cannot be expected to divulge much about the emotional extremes they easily experienced during combat. It is enough that one of them mentioned having looked death in the face. Poets, however, and some other writers are not so restrained. They can reveal in imaginative detail what close combat did to them during battle action and afterwards, but stark revelations of revolting details of infantry combat are not useful to recruiting for future wars. Preferable to honest, detailed description is the use of generalizations like honor and service and focus on the higher motives and honorable actions of soldiers fighting by the rules of war. Diction Hemingway decries in A Farewell to Arms. Despite Hemingway, we can speak of the code of the warrior, which applies most directly to the combat arms, the infantry, armor, and artillery. If you want to see some of the best, most moving things ever written about the soldier and about a warrior, look at Douglas MacArthur's speeches. He was a prose poet. They're overdone, but he takes you right with him, as he overdid, especially his speech to the Rainbow Division in 1935 when he was Chief of Staff doing a reunion of that division from World War I. The term infantry arose in 16th century Spain, which had the first professional standing army in Europe since the days of ancient Rome. Spain at the time appointed young royal princes who were called infantes to command troops, and their men were known as infanteria. I can pronounce that any way I want. In modern times, the role of the infantry is spelled out. I can't, Alan. In the Australian, this is the code of the infantry. The Australian and New Zealand Army and the Canadian Army, the U.S. Army, and the U.S. Marine Corps, the role is basically to close with and destroy the enemy. Some armies add kill or capture, seize the ground the enemy holds, or to repel him by fire in close combat. The infantry takes the most casualties, more than the artillery who shoot cannon and rockets, more than the armor who fight with tanks, and certainly more than the finance corps. These are real corps. The medical service corps, the chemical corps, the civilian affairs corps, and the like. The combat arms, the infantry, artillery, and armor are what we generally call the warriors. The most famous codes or rules of warfare are the 4 Geneva Conventions from 1864 to 1949 dealing with the rights of wartime prisoners and with protections for the wounded and civilians in and near war zones. Individual soldiers have their own codes relating to the right actions of war. And ethics is simply right actions. Many have tried to explain the code of the warrior, and many such codes have value in describing what makes a warrior fight, what rules he adheres to, how he fights, and so forth. The Japanese samurai code of honor, discipline, and morality was known as Bushido. We heard that mentioned last night. Literally, the way of the warrior. The Bushido way was developed between the 16th and 20th centuries. Today's armies and subunits in armies often have creeds and codes that reflect some of these principles of Bushido, which Inazo Natobe calls virtues in his book, Bushido, the Soul of Japan. The 7 virtues are righteousness, courage, benevolence, respect, sincerity, honor, and loyalty. He names 4 associated virtues: self-control, filial piety, wisdom, and fraternal respect. Sounds like us in this room, doesn't it? Natobe's book was a bestseller after it was published in 1899 in English and was read by many influential foreigners who had an interest in their various armies. Armies around the world have mottos based on some or many of these virtues. Branches of the American frontline military reflect some of these virtues in their mottos. The U.S. Navy, not self, but country. Marine Corps, as you know, Semper Fidelis, always faithful. Navy SEALs, not especially inspiring. The only easy day was yesterday. U.S. Coast Guard rescue swimmers, noble men, so others may live. Army Rangers, sua sponte, of their own accord, meaning the headquarters gives the Rangers an objective: blow this up, capture these people, kill this group, and tells them where it is and lets them go. You do it the way you want to. Get there however you want, because they know that the Rangers know more how to do it than the headquarters does. Air Force pararescue, that others may live. Army Special Forces, so-called Green Berets. De oppresso liber, from oppressed to free, often mistranslated, to free the oppressed. At a family supper last month, a friend who had lived in France while formerly married to a member of the French Foreign Legion, I kid you not, said she had been taking Aikido lessons for 2 years. She mentioned some of the graceful moves, and I asked about the basic purpose of learning Aikido, A-I-K-I-D-O. Maybe you've heard of it. Seems it is a Japanese martial art developed by Morihei Ueshiba as a synthesis of his martial studies, philosophy, and religious beliefs. Aikido is often translated as the way of unifying with life energy, or as the way of the harmonious spirit. Ueshiba's goal was to create an art that practitioners could use to defend themselves while also protecting their attacker from injury. That sounds almost like the various innocuous mottos of Rangers, Marines, SEALs, and Special Forces, mottos that do not suggest precisely what they do in combat. Protecting one's attacker from injury, for goodness sakes. I've had some infantry training in hand-to-hand combat, and some of it was terrifying, as when an instructor disarmed an opponent as a demonstration who had a large, sharp knife, disarmed him several times, showing different methods of doing so, and each time the knife flew high, end over end, into the tightly packed group of Ranger candidates encircling and witnessing the demonstration. How we avoided serious injury, I still do not understand. In hand-to-hand combat, the object in every move, every action, was to leave one's opponent on the ground, dead. Humankind cannot bear very much reality, we are told. Are we really talking about war, combat, confronting those who would hurt or kill us with all of these avowals of faithfulness, helping others, freeing the oppressed, protecting the attacker from injury? The reality is, the honesty resides in coming to grips with a person who intends to kill you up close and personal. Paul Fussell. Now, I'm going to quote some from Paul Fussell. He wrote some nationally best-selling books about his war experience, but he was basically an English professor who wrote articles and books in my field, 18th century English, early 18th century satire. He and two other wonderful editors, one of them British, published a book, Restoration 18th Century Literature, in 1969, big hogback book, and it is so wonderful, so inclusive, so well edited. You know about college, university textbooks, every 3 years you usually get another edition, even of Shakespeare, because you get a new preface. This book is still in print, first published in 1969. I used it for 40 years, and one or two competitors came on the line in paperback, but they didn't succeed. He was a great editor, but he was also a great writer about war. Paul Fussell has a masterful essay, Thank God for the Atom Bomb, published in the New Republic, August 1981, in which he focuses on the importance of experience, sheer vulgar experience, in influencing, if not determining, one's views about soldiering. He was a wounded Army lieutenant in the European theater at age 20 years old, a platoon leader. And he knew he'd have to go fight in Japan. Everybody, all the soldiers and Marines were glad, and the Navy, that we dropped that atom bomb, because they were going to die on the beaches. They figured it'd be 1 million casualties on the Japanese beaches, because we had to do something to stop Japan. He says in this article, the experience I'm talking about is having to come to grips face to face with an enemy who designs your death. The experience is common to those in the Marines and the Army Infantry, and even in the Line Navy, To those, in short, who fought the Second World War, mindful always that their mission was, as they were repeatedly assured, to close with the enemy and destroy him. Destroy, notice, not hurt, frighten, drive away, or capture. I think there's something to be learned about that war, as well as the tendency of historical memory unwittingly to resolve ambiguity and generally clean up the premises by considering the way testimonies emanating from the World War experiences tend to complicate attitudes about the most cruel ending of that most cruel war. Fussel's essay is not to be missed if the reader is tough-minded and not tender-minded. It is for the Popes and Swift of this world, Swifts, and not the Wordsworths and Shelleys. It is easily accessible on the internet. Mac Wyckoff, in his histories on the 2nd and 3rd South Carolina Infantry Regiments from 1861 to 65, comes as close as any of I have read describing the often omitted details of infantry combat in that war. Surely some unpleasant details are out there in other books and articles on that war. The details I know most are from World War I and World War II, and I will not recount them, rest assured, only suggest that they exist in some accounts. Anyone remotely interested in what infantry combat is like might look into a well-known book by a gentle man who became a college professor of biology following World War II, after taking 2 degrees in biology from Auburn and a doctorate from the University of Florida. His book is entitled With the Old Breed, From Peleliu to Okinawa. Has anyone ever read that book? Yes, you know how good it is. And there is hardly a memoir of combat so honest, unadorned, and detailed as his. I had a half-read copy of With the Old Breed in the pocket of my tattered Army field jacket in 2008, 68. The entire time I was an embedded journalist assigned to the 3rd Battalion, 8th Marines in Kandahar, Helmand, and Farah provinces, the latter on the front lines against the Taliban. Marines have especially respected the Army Special Forces from the time of the Vietnam War, where they fought almost alongside each other near Khe Sanh. And they especially appreciated an Army SF vet in the middle of the desert with Eugene Sledge's book in his pocket, which all proper Marines have read or know about. Soldiers squeamish about killing other human beings. If Robert Wallace Shand and William Boucher Bose did not mind doing their combat duty, I do not understand why Dave Grossman would write a book on killing, 1996, whose thesis is that most soldiers do not want to kill. In fact, more than half frontline infantrymen refuse to fire their weapons in combat, fail to do what they were trained to do, he says, after his research. Dave Grossman is a retired Army Lieutenant Colonel, Ranger-qualified parachute infantryman who served in some first-rate Army units, and especially he was never in combat. Apparently he was never in combat. He drew on the findings of General S.L.A. Marshall, who was a chief U.S. Army combat historian during World War II and the Korean War. Marshall wrote about 30 books on warfare, and in one of them he famously claimed that only 1 in 4 frontline combat soldiers in the European theater of operations during World War II fired his weapon at all, on the front lines, in battle. 1 in 4 fired his weapon, he says. He interviewed troops just behind the front lines after a number of battles and recorded what the troops told him hot after battle. His conclusion was that most soldiers do not want to kill anyone. A controversy developed over Marshall's conclusion in the book Men Against Fire, 1947. I disagree with this claim of his and with much in Grossman's book. Surveys and studies during and after the Vietnam War show that a much higher percentage of soldiers fired their weapons in combat in that war, 80% or more. Even that percentage is disturbing. Marshall especially, and Grossman somewhat, have had serious critics questioning and debunking their findings. Still, the two celebrity writers on firing ratios of soldiers in combat have their followings. I have interviewed scores of frontline infantry combat veterans. What I learned from them was far different from General Marshall's conclusion. As a result of teaching a literature of war course at the Citadel for 20 years, during which I had a combat veteran speaking 50 minutes to every Friday class, and from interviewing 30 or more local combat veterans of 3 wars and publishing their accounts under fire in the Charleston Mercury, I learned that well-trained soldiers, especially infantry small unit leaders, were quick to fire their weapons and to order the men under them likewise to shoot, to pin down the enemy in order to give their own men opportunities to close with and destroy the enemy. That is the most basic tactic in the most elementary confrontation in infantry combat on the squad and platoon level. If all of your men are firing at known or suspected enemy positions, the enemy will keep his head down and give you and your men time and room to maneuver against him. In the long run, that protects soldiers under fire. In the long history of warfare, most casualties occur when troops run in the face of an advancing enemy. They are hacked down or shot from behind, in the back. Returning fire, shooting back, is the surest way to make the enemy duck, take cover, and cease shooting until he figures out what to do, or until your firing abates. As I learned in extensive infantry training, what you want is fire superiority on the battlefield. Well, I can see that I'm not going to finish in time, and so I'm going to have to pass over some stuff here. I will tell you, here's Stephen Ambrose, Citizen Soldiers. It's a good... yeah, well, you took some of my time. Well, okay. I'll get back here. Let me see. I want to show you how stupid I was, I hope was, in one of these things. Fire superiority in the battlefield. Along the same line, I recently heard a persuasive speaking expert say that the person who does the most talking in a committee meeting usually prevails in whatever decisions are made. Seems to be an equivalence between talking like a machine gun and firing a machine gun to keep one's adversaries silent. I didn't learn that doing academic committee meetings, the most boring thing in life. In my experience with memoirs, history, discussions, and interviews with combat veterans, with reading into the literature of war, especially World War I poetry, the best of all literature of war after the Iliad and perhaps the Aeneid, and in my own memories of serious infantry training, which I cannot exorcise, I would conclude that superior warriors on the whole always behave like Achilles, Ajax, judicious and courageous and wise Odysseus, and even the brave but gentle Aeneas. Regular warriors, average soldiers, however, react violently in combat, not so much to prove their superiority like Achilles as to help ensure their own survival, take aim and shoot first or be shot. They also fire their weapons to fulfill the obligations to protect soldiers on each side of themselves. Soldiers live and die in small, tightly bonded groups, which make up larger and larger groups up to battalion, division, and corps level and beyond. Similarly, a history teacher, for example, I'm really going out on a limb here, teaches his subject every week to honor the profession of history in which he is well educated. He also works hard to teach well for his students, his department, for the School of Humanities or Social Sciences, or whatever one calls it these days, and for the college or university. If a professor simply stops teaching, no explanation forthcoming, his department head will confront him. So it is with soldiering. If a soldier under fire will not fire his weapon, he can be sure a squad sergeant are in charge of 10 men, you can see them, a squad sergeant will quickly grab him by the small of the stock and, over the battle din, scream in his face that he had better take aim and fire before the man berating him kills him himself. Close combat is no place for gentleness, no place for pansies. The Battle of Landing Zone X-Ray in the Ia Drang Valley, the lost platoon. Everything I say is true, isn't it? You know. Mel Gibson starred in the 2002 movie We Were Soldiers, based on the 1992 book We Were Soldiers Once and Young by Hal Moore and Joe Galloway, who were in the middle of that battle. The book includes a detailed history of the three-day battle of Landing Zone X-Ray in the Ia Drang Valley in November 1965. Early in the battle, a newly minted Ranger-qualified infantry officer, aged 24, leaps from his helicopter onto the battlefield, sees several North Vietnamese soldiers disappearing into the woods, and impulsively leads his platoon running after them while ignoring his assigned position in the battalion's perimeter. Lieutenant Henry Herrick's platoon is soon surrounded on a knoll by the enemy, and during the 3 days of battle, he and 8 of his soldiers were killed and 13 wounded behind enemy lines out of the 29 men on the knoll. A year and a half before the Ia Drang Valley, where I lost a good friend at the Citadel, a classmate, I was in Army Ranger training during the swamp phase in April 1964. Lying in a tight perimeter defense while our Ranger candidate patrol leader was conferring with the Ranger instructor off to the side in the dense swamp, I saw an aggressor in a light green uniform 30 yards away in the brush. Feeling bulletproof and 10 feet tall, I nudged my Ranger buddy, Ken Nash. I called him April, first time in 35 years. He remembered the incident, remembered everything, and we're going to meet this summer. He's a retired Army colonel. I nudged my Ranger buddy, Ken Nash, who rose and ran with me trying to capture an aggressor. It had never been done before. They were the poor slobs in an Army unit assigned to be our opponents in Ranger School, and they were sorely afraid of meeting us face to face. I threw my rifle in a dead run. I threw my rifle to Ken Nash, ran faster, and soon tackled the aggressor high and rode him down face first into the damp ground, my arms encircling him high around his upper arms. Then a huge master sergeant plopped down on top of me in the same fashion. I was sandwiched between 2 aggressors, unable to move. The old master sergeant said, with his 3-day growth next to my cheek, holding me down, "It ain't started yet." I thought I could take them both. Common sense prevailed. I rose quietly, found Ken back there looking for me, and stealthily we returned to our place in the defensive perimeter, mercifully unseen by the Ranger instructor. Surely I would have been killed if I had done such a stupid thing in the Vietnam War going on at the time. But I knew it was only training, and I excused myself knowing that it was only a game. Still, it was stupid. Too much invincible Ranger spirit. Later, when I was an A-team leader in the 11th Special Forces Group with real soldiers under my command in a Virginia swamp into which we had just made a night parachute jump after flying 2 hours down from the Army Special Forces headquarters on Staten Island, I acted like a proper officer accomplishing the 5-day mission while taking care of my troops. I had grown up a bit in a couple of years. What Lieutenant Herrick had done with his platoon in the Vietnam War was not lost on me. When he was long dead and I was long out of the Army, alive because my Ranger aggressive moment was in training and his was not. I mentioned the chase episode in the Florida swamp to suggest what serious infantry training can do to a formerly rather mild-mannered young man whose major delight in life was the serious study of literature. Thus it is with the citizen soldier, who after proper training is more soldier than citizen for a limited time. Ambrose, Citizen Soldiers. Stephen Ambrose concludes his 1997 book, Citizen Soldiers, by saying in 1996 he was visiting professor at the University of Wisconsin teaching a course on World War II to 350 students. Quote, "They were dumbstruck by descriptions of what it was like to be on the front lines. They were even more amazed by the responsibilities carried by junior officers and NCOs, those are sergeants, who were as young as they. Like all of us who have never been in combat," Ambrose wrote, "they wondered if they could have done it, and even more, they wondered how anyone could have done it." As you might have derived, how anyone could have done it is a question I have tried to pose in the preceding suggestions of almost unimaginable and terrifying aspects of infantry combat. How did our young Confederate and Union soldiers and the older ones stand 4 years of intermittent battles, some battles in which tens of thousands were killed and wounded in 1 to 3 days? Training helps. Courage fills in the balance, I suppose. Citizen soldiers close to home. This is a winding down, a long one, but a winding down. What does it mean to us, this discussion of citizen soldiers? Where would we be without soldiers? Maybe still a British colony grown unified in Yankee materialism. Who knows? American soldiers of the Revolution and Confederate soldiers paradoxically ensured a Southern identity, at least until 2015. Knowing too much genealogy can be stultifying or inspiring. Depressing ambition by holding up models too glorious for us to begin to emulate, or suggesting that we're the stuff that family traits are made on, and our little life is rounded by looking within as a guide to acting without. All of us have forebears who were soldiers of one kind or another, usually more of them than we know about, since before the American Revolution. My father, a citizen sailor, a naval officer in the Pacific in World War II, was an amateur genealogist who is responsible for some of my recounting this morning a line of citizen soldiers on his side of the family. My father had a Huguenot name, and the Remberts and DuBoses account for a number of citizen soldiers, fewer high-ranking soldiers than the ancestors of a number of you in this room, I have no doubt. But I won't focus on them, except for one. I will focus on the Celtic lines, a mention of a Scotsman and a look at some Welshmen. In the Scottish line, Colonel Hawks Hay, commander of the 2nd Regiment of Orange County Volunteers in New York, quote, rendered important services on the Hudson River during the first year of the war of the American Revolution, says a book on the Hay family in 1908. The direct Welsh line were Joneses, who traditionally had no middle names on purpose to distinguish themselves from other Joneses. Their given names usually confined to 4, Cadwallader, Allen, Robin, and one other I forget. Brigadier General Allen Jones was commander of battalions of militiamen in the Halifax district of North Carolina before and during the American Revolution. Major Cadwallader Jones was aide-de-camp to General Lafayette during the Revolution. Lafayette gave each of his aides a sword made of Toledo steel. A cousin has our ancestor's sword in Charleston. Cadwallader Jones, born in 1813, was a colonel commanding the 12th South Carolina Infantry Regiment at Sharpsburg and several other battles. His son, Allen Jones, my great-grandfather, was wounded at Petersburg. And incidentally, my father's first cousin, another Cadwallader Jones, class of Citadel class of 1942, fought in World War II and founded Jones Ford in Charleston 48 years ago. All of these were citizen soldiers. He's a most Christian young man, an old man. Quaddy Jones, does anybody ever met him in Charleston? He's well known. He died 8 years ago, I think. On my mother's side, the Aldriches, who came from Massachusetts to Charleston in 1780, and the Wymans, who came to Barnwell District from Massachusetts in 1825, fathered a number of sons and grandsons, all of whom fought for the Confederacy. The future Judge James Aldrich, born in the village of Barnwell in 1850, at age 14, joined the Confederate Army in the company of Colonel Thomas Roper, founder of Roper Hospital in Charleston. In 1869, this James Aldrich entered Washington College in Lexington, Virginia, and became a favorite of General and Mrs. Lee, often in their home for meals, the record shows. He was chosen as one of the guards of honor to attend the body of Lee as it lay in state. Ultimately, I was named for him. We're close. Joel Wentworth Wyman was born in 1800 in Massachusetts, came to Barnwell District in South Carolina in 1825 after graduating first in his class in the first graduating class from Amherst College in his home state. He was at first a preceptor or headmaster of a private school in South Carolina and later an honor graduate of the Medical College of South Carolina. Edward McCready, Jr., in his edition of Cyclopedia of Eminent and Representative Men of South Carolina, 1892, has an entry on the Wyman brothers. The entry says that some federal officers right after the war were visiting Dr. Wyman in a slave cabin on his property and talking with him. And they said, they saw the beautiful trees and garden in this burned down house of that mansion and said, "You're from the North, why didn't you ask for leniency?" And his looking the officer squarely in the eye, the doctor replied, "Sir, do you think that a man who had sent 5 sons into the Southern Army would sacrifice his principles by begging for his home?" Then I'm going to summarize quickly what happened to this man, Dr. Joel, one of his sons, Harry Hastings Wyman, had a twin brother that joined the Confederacy at age 16 from Macon, South Carolina. They fought 4 years in the war. Last year of the war, the Battle of Swift Creek in fall of 64, they were going up a ridge and they met in a skirmish line, 10 soldiers, 10 feet between soldiers, just a skirmish line, met a Yankee battle line at the top of the ridge. The Yankees opened fire, cut down a lot of the Confederates returned fire and retreated, of course. And Hastings Wyman's son, twin brother Hay Wyman, was shot in the stomach. His brother, my grandfather told me this story. It was his father who grabbed his twin brother, pulled him behind a tree, took him back to a tent. He died, and Hastings Wyman finished the war alive. When the Southern Army under Joseph E. Johnston was surrendering to Sherman at in Greensboro on April 26, 1865. Hastings Wyman stood at the back of his regiment, 20 years old, and they went through the procedure of the surrender, and he picked up his rifle, quietly turned around, and walked away. And he started heading southwest to Texas to join the Army of General Edmund Kirby Smith, who was still fighting at that time. Well, while he was on the way, Kirby Smith surrendered, so he turned around, went back to Aiken, went to the medical college, and became a well-known doctor. And there's a book that I found, published in 1905, different from McCrady's book, called Eminent Men of South Carolina. And I thumbed through it and saw the 19th century ancestors of a lot of my friends and relatives. Near the end, I came upon the Wyman brothers, and it mentioned, no, that was the other book. This book came upon Dr. Harry Hastings Wyman. All the entries were one page. It said what a beloved physician he had been in Aiken County. And then it concluded, and I memorized this sentence, but I'm going to read it to you anyway. The last sentence said, Dr. Wyman was proud of his service in the Confederate Army to the end of his life. He's the one whose twin brother was killed beside him. Fought for 4 years, 16 to 20, age 20. Proud of his service to the end of his life, and was especially proud that he was never captured, never surrendered, never paroled, and never swore allegiance to the federal government. The young man had sworn an oath of allegiance to the Confederacy upon his enlistment, and apparently he was unprepared to swear another oath to the government of his recent enemies. That, dear friends, is the kind of citizen soldier I especially honor. He was a man, take him for all in all. I shall not look upon his like again. Robert Wallace Shand, William Prochet de Bose, Harry Hastings Wyman, each a volunteer among the hundreds of thousands of privates and officers in the Confederate States Army. This is the Confederate soldier of worldwide repute. To him we render a grateful, firm salute. This is the citizen soldier in tattered shreds, to whom all men in arms should bow their heads. Sorry about that. I'm only half responsible.